I think we'll go ahead and get started here. So welcome everyone to another installment of our Sustainable Energy Seminar Series from the Wisconsin Energy Institute. If this is your first time joining one of our programs, welcome. If you're a repeat attendee, well, we appreciate and welcome you as well. My name is Scott Williams. I'm the Education Manager here at the Wisconsin Energy Institute. And the Sustainable Energy Seminar is what we hold every other week during the fall and the spring semesters. And our goal is to highlight the cutting edge research that's happening across UW-Madison and beyond. And another goal is to showcase how different disciplines understand energy challenges and develop solutions. So throughout the series, we hear from experts in science and engineering, as well as social sciences and humanities, to learn about the ways in which they view sustainable energy challenges and solutions. This seminar is open to the public, but it's also a course for students in the undergraduate Engineering for Energy Sustainability certificate, as well as the Master's in Sustainable Systems Engineering. This seminar is offered online through Zoom webinar, and if you registered for today's webinar, you will have the link to join the remaining two webinars for this semester. And if you're interested in live captioning, you can click the Show Captions button at the bottom of your screen to toggle that feature. If you have a question for our presenter, please use the Q&A box linked at the bottom of your screen. If you have a clarifying question, I can find a good stopping point to interrupt and ask that question. And if it's a longer question, we'll have plenty of time toward the end of the presentation to do Q&A. So please feel free to add your questions in any time during the presentation. And with that, I'll introduce today's presenter. Paul Kelleher is a professor of bioethics and philosophy at UW-Madison, and his research and teaching explore the ethical and other philosophical dimensions of public policy, especially climate policy and health policy. And he recently published a book that's titled The Social Cost of Carbon, Ethics and the Limits of Climate Change Economics. And this important measure will be the topic of today's presentation. So welcome, Professor Kelleher.
Great, excuse me. Thanks so much, Scott. Thanks for everyone for joining. Like Scott said, feel free to put clarifying questions into the Q&A as we go. And we'll try to get to those, and then we'll hopefully have some time at the end to discuss as well. I have myself down here on the bottom left of your screen. That might mean I'm on your screen twice if you have your normal Zoom images up, video up of participants. So you can always, I think, toggle that second one to reduce it, so there's just one of me if two is too many. Today's discussion is presentation is, as Scott said, about the social cost of carbon and how it's used in climate change policy analysis. There's a lot to say about what the social cost of carbon is and how it works under the hood, and I've tried hard to pick out some highlights that I hope won't be too deep in the weeds, but that I think are important for understanding important differences between different uses and even different concepts of the social cost of carbon. So we'll get to that as we go. The social cost of carbon is a really important concept in economics and in climate change policy analysis. It has been said to be some pretty high highfalutin things. One, the most important single economic concept in the economics of climate change from Bill Nordhaus, who won the Nobel Prize in economics for his work in this area in 2018, maybe. The most important number you've never heard of. Economists love to say that one because it's their way hook to get you interested in, well, what in the world is this number that's so important that I should have heard about it, but I haven't. I love this one. This is from really funny and engaging, great environmental economics, Max Aufhammer. The one number that rules them all, the one number that every government across the globe should use. So I hope to give you a sense of why economists think so highly about the social cost of carbon and whether they should think so highly about it, or in what context we should think maybe highly about one concept but need to use a different one. Just by way of further introduction, the social cost of carbon, or the SCC, is somewhat misnamed because nowadays the social cost of carbon refers to the social cost of carbon dioxide. So, as the National Academies of Engineering, Science, and Medicine put it in an important 2017 a report, the social cost of carbon, and then you see that CO2 number there, or rather CO2 written out there. The social cost of carbon is an economic metric intended to provide a comprehensive estimate of the net damages. That is the monetized value of the net impacts, both negative and positive, from the global climate change that results from a small 1 metric ton increase in carbon dioxide emissions. So it's a measure of the impact, and at the end of the day, it's supposed to be a dollar figure, a measure of the impact done by releasing 1 extra ton of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. Okay, so that's what the social cost of carbon is. I will continue to use that social cost of carbon term, even though what we're talking about is a ton of carbon dioxide. You could compute it in terms of a social cost of carbon. It's just that the number would get larger if you're talking about a ton of carbon rather than a ton of carbon dioxide. Okay. The social cost of carbon, and this is how I like to describe it in the first instance, it is a packaging up of all the impacts done from an extra ton of carbon dioxide. So what do I mean by that? Well, here's a little simple diagram to illustrate in sort of broad strokes what we mean here. So what we have here is we have two things depicted in terms of a baseline trajectory. We have an emissions baseline here in this bottom line. And then up above it, the blue line, which coincides with the red, but blue starts here too. The blue line is a change in consumption over time. So that's roughly speaking a measure of the goods and services that, say, an average person in a given year or a given time period would enjoy. And so what is depicted here is that in an early period 2 here, I guess, there is one small increase in the amount of emissions. That's supposed to be our 1 ton increase. And as a result of that, the trajectory of the amount of goods and services that people will be able to enjoy out into the future is changed somewhat. So you can see maybe it's not changed so much in early years, but as we get further into the future, we have this decline. That's the red line. We have this decline in the amount of consumption that the average person across the globe, or maybe it's one region, gets to enjoy. And so you can sort of think of that as climate damages eating into consumption possibilities as the result of a 1 ton increase in greenhouse gas emissions. Now, of course, we don't just emit 1 ton in a year, for example. We emit many, many, many tons. But again, this concept is meant to capture a very small the change, the monetized damages from a very small change in emissions, and we'll sort of come back to why it's the very small change that we're interested in. Okay. Now, one thing that I have tried to bring to the fore in climate change economics and policy analysis is that it turns out that there are different ways of packaging the changes. So if we go back here, you see this any difference between the blue baseline and the red result of the pulse of emissions is a change in consumption possibilities. And the social cost of carbon is a packaging up of the change, of the difference made by that unit of emissions down here in this early period. And it turns out that for different analytical purposes, there are different packaging ups, if I could coin a phrase, different ways of packaging up those differences in consumption possibilities to serve that analytical purpose. I realize that doesn't make much sense to most of you or any of you without in further explanation, but it is important to say in the first instance, and I'm going to try to explain. That's the thing that I principally want to try to explain is what are two different analytical purposes that you might think that the way you address that or think about that for policy evaluation purposes is to package up those changes in consumption in different ways. What are these analytical purposes? So I'm going to discuss two of them. These are the two main ones. So the first one is using a social cost of carbon as a measure of the benefit of reducing emissions. So if you think in the context of a cost-benefit analysis, you might want to ask the following question. If we reduce our emissions by some small amount today, is that on balance a good thing? Well, one way of further specifying and then trying to answer that question is to say, well, we might know how much it costs to reduce 1 ton of emissions today. Well, what are the benefits? Well, the costs are in terms of dollars, and so we want to know what the benefits are in terms of dollars. That's why we want to package up, as I've been putting it, the benefits that will occur, from now out into the further future. We want to package those up into one number so that we can compare the good that would be achieved by preventing all those climate damages that eat into consumption possibilities. Compare those with the costs that we have to pay now. So that's one purpose for which you might want a social cost of carbon number. You might want to just ask, is the good that's achieved by an emissions reduction sufficient to compensate for the bad that would be involved with that reduction? That is the costs of having to pay whatever costs you would have to pay to reduce a ton of emissions. Okay, so that's one analytical purpose. It's a cost-benefit analysis. Is some policy or project for reducing emissions a good idea or a good thing? Okay, second, put that up here. I meant to refer to that when I was talking about packaging up these changes in consumption emissions, changes and damages rather in consumption possibilities, so that you could compare the aggregate benefit with the cost. Okay, so now here's the second analytical purpose. Trying to come up with the right tax to put on behavior that emits greenhouse gases. In this case, emits carbon dioxide. You could also have a tax for methane, and that would be the social cost of methane. And then you could talk about the total social costs of emitting behaviors, and that might be called the social cost of greenhouse gases. So those terms tend to be used in different contexts. Okay, now, a main question is, should the way we think about packaging the differences here between consumption possibilities and the result of damages eating into those possibilities, should we think of that packaging up should we think of the way that we would package those differences up to come up with one number? Do we think of that the same way when we're in the cost-benefit analysis sandbox as we would when we're thinking about things in terms of a carbon tax sandbox? And the answer is no, we shouldn't think of them, we shouldn't necessarily think of them the same. And I want to talk you through why not. Okay, so we're coming to the sort of most economicsy part of the talk, and I apologize to those of you who are somewhat allergic to that. So let's talk about the context in which the social cost of carbon is not a way of packaging up climate damages in order to run a cost-benefit analysis of a emissions reduction policy. But when we want to package up the damages from a marginal ton of emissions for the purpose of a carbon tax. When economists are talking about things in this mode, they are thinking of a framework. Some of you might have encountered this framework in Econ 101 or beyond. They're thinking about a framework in which there are some idealized assumptions that we can make. Idealized assumption number one, think about the possibility of future generations and present generations interacting with one another in a way that they could come to bargains about who's going to pay for emissions reductions and who's going to make those reductions. So for example, you can imagine that if we stipulated that we were in a world where the present generation has rights to emit, all the rights to emit that they want. And so they go ahead and do that. But future generations would love to be able to use some of their disposable income that they will inherit when they arrive onto the scene in 50, 100, 200 years. They would love to use some of that in order to say to us, hey, could you please take some of this money in exchange for emitting a little bit less because these climate damages are annoying to terrifying. And we would love to trade you some of our disposable income for your reducing your emissions. Now, sure, that would be great if we lived in an Econ 101 framework where all property rights were well defined and all participants in the economy could interact with one another and make offers to one another for trading goods or trading goods and services. But we don't live in that world. The world we live in is one where the present generation pretty much gets to emit what they want, and future generations have no say in the matter until they arrive on the scene and discover that their atmosphere has been polluted and have no ability to offer the present generation some inducement for reducing our emissions here and now. And from an Econ 101 framework, we could talk about it in a bit more sophisticated framework, a general equilibrium framework. The breakdown here is the fact that we can't bargain across generations. If we could bargain, things would be different, but because we can't, we end up at this, and this is just a very stylized diagram. We end up with the present generation's amount of consumption on the x-axis here, the future generations' consumption possibilities on the y-axis here. I'll tell you about this frontier in a moment, what that means. But we end up here, and I'm going to call that BAU, or business as usual. We end up in a position where actually it looks possible to make future generations better off than they currently are, present generations better off than they currently are, or some combination in between if we could just change something. Well, what's the thing that we could change? Well, if we could find a way to let people in the future offer us money, offer us goods and services in compensation for our reducing our emissions here today, then we might end up in a position where we go from this business as usual point all the way to this frontier. In economics, this is called the Pareto frontier. All the way to this frontier where we've made all of the trades we can make. The future has offered us all the money that they can offer us to the point where now we're no longer willing to accept any more money to reduce our emissions because we've done that quite a bit, for example. We've gotten to a point on this frontier where any change now involves making one person or one group of people better off and making another group of people worse off. So for example, if we end up right here on this line, then in order to increase present consumption this way, we have to reduce future consumption by going down. That's what that curved line means. Since we don't have the ability to interact with future generations, we end up down here in a position where if we could somehow arrange a transfer of goods and services from the future to the present, we could actually fully insulate the present generation from suffering any change in their consumption. So that's moving along this vertical line here, all the way up to the frontier where future generations have been made better off. How would we do that? Well, there are ways we could do that. We could take out a debt instrument now. We could fully compensate the present generation with debt, give them more money to spend on green consumption, and then future generations would have to pay that debt off when they arrive on the scene. That's an example. We'd have to create new global institutions to do it, but it's theoretically possible if we could create those institutions. So the fact that we have an inability to bargain across generations means we end up down here. Okay, so that's just the scenario that we're in. I've told you about what this frontier means. It means every point on this frontier is a point where it's no longer possible to make one party better off without making another party worse off. Anytime we're down below this frontier, it is possible because we could just go off to the northeast, and that makes both parties better off. Now, I think I saw a hand. I don't know if we want to take that, Scott, before I explain how carbon taxes get into the mix here.
I think he lowered his hand really quickly, so it might have just been an accident.
Okay, so put your question into the Q&A if you still want to, and then Scott can interrupt. Okay, so how do carbon taxes get in? Well, in the economic framework where property rights are well defined and uh, agents across time can interact or at least bargain with one another without any transactions costs, it turns out that no matter how you assign the rights, whether it's present generation has the right to emit as much as they want, or future generations have a right to, for example, a stable climate at 1990 levels, and then anything beyond that, they would have to be compensated for tolerating a reduction in that, compensated by the current generation. No matter how you assign the rights to emit, and the rights over conventional resources in the economy, bargaining would get you to this frontier. That's just like that's the conventional virtue of a free market economy in the context where rights are well defined. You end up with going from this business as usual point to some point on the line because you've had trades between future generation and present generation, and now you end up here where no one wants to trade anymore. And the reason why no one wants to trade anymore is because you can't end up with making one person better off without making another person worse off. And it turns out that in the econ models that are used to analyze the climate change problem as a conventional problem of a pollution externality, where pollution from economic behavior on the part of one agent harms the consumption possibilities of another agent. When you think about it in that way, then anytime you have a point on the frontier, any point on the frontier, it will always be true that the cost of dirty consumption will equal the sum of the following two things: the direct costs of having to pay for that consumption and the external costs that come in the form of impacts on other people, your pollution impacts on other people. And why would that be the case? Why is what's in this little box here at the bottom true? Well, think about it this way. Suppose we gave future generations rights over the atmosphere. So rights to have the atmosphere at stable 1990 levels, and any change from that, they would have to be willing to accept the change. And the only reason they would be willing to accept that is if they were compensated by some amount of other conventional goods. Okay, so suppose that were our scenario. Well, at any point on this line, wherever we end up from bargaining, the future generations being willing to sell a little bit of their atmospheric quality or allow a degrading of their atmospheric quality in order to be richer in conventional terms, any point where that bargaining with current generations ends is a point where anyone in the current generation would face the following costs of driving their internal combustion engine. They would face the direct costs of having to pay for the car and pay for the gas and pay for the maintenance. Okay, so that's the direct costs or the internalized costs that any agent engaging in dirty consumption has to pay. But then they would also have to pay the external costs. They would also have to pay future generations to tolerate the climate damages that were going to come from the emission of tailpipe exhaust. And that's what we mean by those external costs. Those external costs are the costs that you would have to pay future generations to compensate them for tolerating what they don't have an obligation to tolerate, because we assumed at the beginning that they had a right not to face that pollution. Nevertheless, they might be willing to accept a payment in order to have a slightly less clean atmosphere, but in order to be richer. So on any point on this line, and I can tell you that it's regardless of how the rights to emit are assigned, that's something you'll just have to trust me on because I don't want to really walk through it. Regardless of whether future generations have a right to a stable climate or present generations have a right to emit as much as they want. At any point on this line, the only way you can ensure that you don't depart from this line, you don't make someone worse off than they would be on the line. The only way that that can happen is if the people who are engaging in dirty consumption have to pay the direct costs and have to pay the external costs of emitting at that point, however, wherever the economy comes to settle. And that packaging up of the external costs that you would have to pay future generations, that is one social cost of carbon concept. And that's the amount of tax that you would have to charge if you were a social planner and you said, well, look, we don't live in this Econ 101 ideal world where future generations and present generations can interact with one another. We live in a world where future generations can pretty much do whatever they want. How are we going to mimic an economy where these different parties can interact with one another? Well, it turns out that there's a theorem in economics that says, it's this called the second fundamental theorem of welfare economics, which says that every point on this line can be decentralized. That means you can guide an economy to it by doing two things. One, imposing a tax on dirty consumption that is equal to what everyone who would be impacted by that dirty consumption would be willing to pay to get you to stop doing it. Okay, so that's that social cost of carbon number. Here I call it the WTP-SCC, by which I mean it's a packaging up of what people who are impacted by your dirty consumption would be willing to pay you to get you to stop. Okay. So every point on this line has a social cost of carbon number associated with it. It's the number it's the total of what everyone who is adversely impacted by pollution would be willing to pay to get the polluter to stop emitting that tiny bit of pollution, that last bit of pollution. And there's a point inside this frontier where you could, for any point on the frontier, there's some point in the frontier where if you gave future people that amount of consumption and present people that amount of consumption indicated by the point, and then imposed a tax associated with whichever point you want to get to, the economic planner can leave things alone and the economy will be guided from being under the line onto the line. That's the magic of the Econ 101 models. Okay, so even if you can't have bargaining between generations, the economists will say you can just imagine where you think that bargaining would end, depending on who you are assuming starts out with which rights and how much wealth each party starts with. You can figure out where that bargaining would end. Would it be way up here where future people are well off, but present people aren't? Would it be down here where present people are well off, but future people aren't as well off? Would it be somewhere in the middle? Wherever you think that bargaining would end, you can estimate the social cost of carbon in terms of what people would be willing to pay to get emitters to emit slightly less at that point where bargaining would end. And you can figure out where in the area underneath the line you would have to allocate conventional wealth. And then you can just tax emissions at that level and let the economy guide itself to that particular point on the frontier. How to summarize that? The way we can summarize that is when the social cost of carbon is presented as a carbon tax, it's assuming this general framework, and it's assuming that some point on this Pareto frontier has been chosen, and that the social cost of carbon associated with emissions at that point, or in an economy that is represented by that point, the external emissions, the damage is done by an extra ton of emissions in that context. You figure out who would be impacted by that ton. You add up what they would all be willing to pay to get the emitter to emit slightly less, and that's the carbon tax you could use to decentralize an economy moving to this point. and that you could get the economy to go from where it is right now, somewhere that you've pre-chosen on the frontier. So that's what it means to say the social cost of carbon is a carbon tax. It's assuming this framework. Okay, now I want to move to this energy policy simulator, which I believe students in this class have been asked to or will soon be asked to engage with. Um, and I want to drill down below the hood, beneath the hood of this simulator to see how they suggest students who are playing around with this simulator can think of the carbon tax and its relation to the social cost of carbon. So let's see what they say. They say, below the description is a small amount of guidance text that aims to help the user decide what might be a reasonable value for the policy lever. So this is, they're making their simulator user-friendly, and they're trying to suggest, as people are using this simulator and trying to figure out what levers might be pulled to result in what emissions change over what time horizon, they're going to give you a little text to indicate to the user what they might be thinking with respect to a different where to move a different policy lever. And then they say, and this is the highlighted part, for example, a user who's unfamiliar with a carbon tax may not have any sense of what constitutes a low, medium, or high value. Accordingly, the guidance text strives to provide a reference point that may help a user decide what numerical setting might be in line with his or her policy preferences. For example, the guidance text for the carbon tax policy mentions that the US government's social cost of carbon estimate for the 2050 year ranges from $32 to $115 per ton. Okay, the message here is the US government has crunched some numbers. They've estimated the social cost of carbon for the year 2050, and somehow that's related to where a user of the simulator might want to set the policy lever, that is the carbon tax. Okay. The number that they're citing here, that range, I think the best I could come up with comes from this early Biden administration social cost of carbon set of estimates from February of 2021, where the range was $32 to not $115, but $116. Interestingly, the simulator mentions that actually the data that's used now in the simulator has been updated to reflect the latest estimates from the EPA, which were released in November 2022. And those estimates had a range of the social cost of carbon from $200 to $480. And that November 2022 document from the EPA was a draft document that went out for peer review and public comment, and EPA finalized those numbers in 2023, the very same numbers, 200 to 480. So the simulator designers, the people who created the simulator, are trying to say, if you are interested in adjusting the carbon tax policy lever in the context of these simulations, you might consider the fact that the US government has estimated the social cost of carbon to be in this range. Okay. But there's a but here. When the US government estimates the social cost of carbon, they are not estimating the packaging up of damages, of what people would be willing to pay to avoid damages that occurs on this frontier. That's the numbers that are associated with the social cost of carbon on the frontier is the Econ 101 or Econ 201 if we've moved into a world where not all of the assumptions in Econ 101 hold. That's the carbon tax, is the social cost of carbon associated with each point on this frontier. When the U.S. government is estimating the social cost of carbon, they are doing it down here. They're asking, what is the dollar amount associated with the packaging up of all of the greenhouse gas of a ton of greenhouse gas emissions, or the damages from a ton of greenhouse gas emissions emitted where we are today? on the business as usual trajectory or on the baseline trajectory. So that's the first difference right there that you might think is relevant. The simulator folks say that the US government's numbers can be thought of as estimates of a carbon tax when the economic theory just doesn't support that. Maybe the numbers end up being the same, but from a conceptual point of view, they're not the same because the US government is focused on packaging up climate damages that would result from 1 ton of emissions emitted today in our very non-ideal situation, not a ton of emissions that are emitted in some different economy where we've somehow moved our way from inside the frontier to some point on the frontier. So that's the first thing to say. Now, why does the US government estimate its social cost of carbon from the business's usual trajectory? Well, it's not because they're thinking of it as a carbon tax. In fact, they're thinking of the social cost of carbon not in the context of trying to figure out what the right carbon tax should be, but in the context of cost-benefit analysis. I don't know if you can remember all the way back 36 minutes ago when I said there are 2 contexts in which a social cost of carbon number has been said to be relevant. One was carbon tax, the other was doing a cost-benefit analysis, where your question is the benefit of emissions reduction greater than the costs of the reduction? When the US government is estimating its social cost of carbon number and it's focused on where we are now, that's its question. It wants to know, do policies that would make some small change in emissions, do they have benefits that outweigh their costs? And if they do, then either the EPA or the Office of Management and Budget or some other federal office will say, okay, it seems like based on cost-benefit analysis, it would be a good thing to have whatever policy it is, a regulation or some other policy that would marginally reduce emissions. Now, when the US federal government does cost-benefit analysis, it adopts a certain very controversial theoretical framework for how it thinks about costs and benefits. And the framework is predicated upon what some people call the compensation principle. The compensation principle says that if a project or policy's winners could fully compensate the policy's losers, those who would suffer costs or pay the costs or some other adverse effect from having the policy in place. If the winners could compensate the losers, then the project is a good thing to do. So when the US government does cost-benefit analysis, it thinks about things in terms of this principle. Now, what are some reasons for why some people aren't so happy with this way of thinking about cost-benefit analysis? Well, the principle doesn't require actual compensation. So for example, if a project increases Bill Gates' income by $10 and reduces a poor person's income by $1, then it might be possible for Bill Gates to say, I've gained so much from this policy that I can fully compensate the losers and still be better off than I was before the policy. This compensation principle says, oh, well, then the policy would be a good thing, even if compensation is never paid. So it's a good thing to make a poor person poorer and Bill Gates richer, so long as it would be theoretically possible for Bill Gates to compensate the losers and still be better off. Okay, so when the US government runs a cost-benefit analysis, that's what it cares about. Is the willingness to pay of the winners higher than the willingness to be compensated, the amount that you would have to be compensated, that the losers would have to be compensated? If it is, then it's a good project or good policy. And if it's not, then it's not a good project. No moral philosopher accepts this principle at all, and certainly not as the basis for doing a cost-benefit analysis. I'm a moral philosopher. That's what I do when I do my research, and there's no ethicist that I know that says, oh yeah, we can determine if a project would be a good thing by asking if simply in principle winners could compensate losers. It might be a good thing if we have a project that makes some people worse off initially, but then they could be fully compensated or maybe even more. Maybe that could be a good thing. But the mere possibility of full compensation doesn't thereby make the project a good thing. So people in my discipline, philosophers, tend not to agree with the way the US government does their cost benefit analysis. But the way the US government does their cost benefit analysis, they want to know, can the people who would benefit, in principle, compensate those who would lose? And the way that you figure that out is you ask, okay, how much would the beneficiaries of the project gain? And what is the financial um, what's the amount of money or the financial change that would have to be made to the losers to make them feel like they were fully compensated? And so now you're in a game of thinking about what people would be willing to pay, what they would be willing to accept. That looks a lot like the sort of game you were in when you were thinking about a carbon tax, when you were thinking about the economy getting to that Pareto frontier from bargains. But it's used to do a very different thing in the context of cost benefit analysis. It's used to implement this compensation principle. So the US government social cost of carbon estimates are meant to measure what future generations would be willing to pay us in exchange for our abatement, so that we could answer, or so that the US government could answer the following question. Would it be in principle possible for future generations to fully compensate us today for the costs that we would incur for reducing our emissions slightly here today? And again, that goes back to that compensation principle. Okay, I'm gonna just note a couple things about that. Number one, if you are trying to run a cost benefit analysis by implementing the compensation principle, then again, what you're interested in is, would the beneficiaries of emissions reductions be willing to pay more than emitters today would have to be paid to be fully compensated for no longer engaging in emissive activities, or maybe it's compensated for having to pay for a scrubber that makes our activities less of a polluting activity. In that uh, in that framework of cost benefit analysis, the way that economists measure the benefit of reducing deaths in the future is by asking what people whose deaths would come, what would they be willing to pay to reduce the risks of their dying? Again, that's to implement that compensation principle-based cost benefit analysis. And so what you end up with is you end up with something like this, where this is an estimate of where the relative fraction of deaths from greenhouse gas emissions will come from over some time horizon. I forget what the horizon is, 100 years, 200 years. I have a reference to this study at the end of the slides. You can email me for the slides or get that from your instructor. And you can see that the large majority of the deaths are going to come from Africa, India, Pakistan, China. And the squiggly little diagrams on the left, that's, North America, South America. And some countries in Europe are reduced to small because not many deaths in relative terms will come from those places. But at the same time, the deaths in those places are valued by US government cost benefit analysis methods, are valued much less than deaths that would result or that will result in the United States. So you can see that here. Here you have the United States at $10 million per death. Actually, now it's about $12 million the US government uses. And you can see that the fraction of deaths expected to come in the United States, fraction of the total, is very small. Meanwhile, you have India, whose fraction of deaths over this time horizon is over 20% of the total, but their monetized value per death is very low. It's down, well below $5 million, probably, on the order of $1 million. And you can see this headline here in the middle: 76% of the deaths from any amount of greenhouse gas emissions, the distribution of the deaths that will come from that amount of emissions occurs in countries where deaths are valued at $1 million or less, compared with 10 million in the United States, 15 million in Qatar. So you can see that this way of implementing cost-benefit analysis, this is the US government's official approach to cost-benefit analysis, systematically devalues the bad impacts that will come in relatively low-income parts of the world. And it's precisely traceable to that compensation principle basis for cost-benefit analysis. So let me just quickly jump ahead here and say, philosophers have an alternative basis for cost-benefit analysis that they commend to the U.S. government and to others. Not all philosophers agree with this, but this is the first alternative to think about if you're thinking about moving away from how the federal government does it today. That alternative is utilitarianism. That's where you don't just add up what people are willing to pay to avoid a climate harm. You ask directly what that harm would be for them in terms of well-being. And when you think about it in that way, you get something that's quite the reverse of the way the US government tends to do it. A dollar's worth of harm to a poor person is very likely to have a much larger well-being impact for that poorer person than a dollar's worth of harm to Bill Gates. So even if Bill Gates is willing to spend, even if Bill Gates were to suffer $3,000 in costs, maybe $300 in benefits to poor people would make the $3,000 cost nevertheless cost benefit justified in terms of utilitarianism, because the amount of well-being that Bill Gates loses when he loses $3,000 is not as much as how a poor person how their well-being changes when they gain $300 in benefit. And so that's a quite different way of thinking about benefits and measuring benefits and costs than when you're working in the framework of just focusing on what people are willing to pay or willing to accept. So utilitarianism doesn't measure benefits in terms of willingness to pay. It does it in terms of impacts on well-being. Utilitarianism actually can value lives equally, regardless of income differences. So you wouldn't have this result that you get that was depicted in the diagrams that I just showed you. Bressler, whose work is the source of those diagrams, he estimates that a utilitarian social cost of carbon in his model would be $3,567 compared to what was the upper end of the US government number? It was like something like $480. Yeah, $480. All right, I can just wrap up quickly by saying the reason why the utilitarian number is different has to do, number one, and this is the largest difference, the approach to valuing lives that the utilitarian approach requires compared to what the compensation principle based approach requires, as well as the fact, and I didn't get into this here, as well as the fact that the utilitarian framework involves lower discount rates. So you end up not discounting the benefits and costs that happen in the future as much as you would if you endorse that compensation principle basis. And that gets into some even more weedy stuff than I could get into or wanted to get into here. Okay, some concluding thoughts. It's challenging to know how a given social cost of carbon estimate is or is not relevant when you're trying to evaluate a carbon tax. Some social cost of carbon estimates are focused on that carbon tax framework. Some social cost of carbon estimates are focused on that compensation principle based framework. Some social cost of carbon estimates are based on that utilitarian framework. The estimates will differ, but they'll differ because of very fundamental theoretical choices that the modeler makes. And so as an end user, if you're just presented with numbers and told this is a social cost of carbon number, you may and probably should have no idea what that means and what it should mean for climate policy analysis generally. Maybe if one understood all of these distinctions and understood the choices the modeler made, then you could have a better sense of that. It's really hard to just read off from a number what that means in terms of a policy analysis question. Okay, number two is basically what I just said. Some SEC figures may tell you nothing at all about what the carbon tax should be because they are, for example, a utilitarian number meant to speak to a utilitarian cost benefit analysis, and that is a totally different framework than the framework that's concerned with estimating carbon taxes. And finally, an important alternative to the carbon tax framework that I described in the context of Econ 101. An important alternative to that is what's sometimes called target-based carbon pricing. So instead of letting the econ analysis of where future and current generations would get to if they could bargain, for example, you just choose a temperature or a net zero date target, and then you use economics tools to work backwards to what the carbon tax would need to be today, tomorrow, next year, into the future to meet that target. And one study that's done that is the study by Kaufman and colleagues in 2020, and their analysis that showed might be too strong, suggested their results were that depending on what your net zero target date is, 2040, 2050, 2060, you get different levels of the carbon tax that would be needed to achieve that net zero. This is in the United States. So you can see that if you have a 2060 target date, your carbon taxes will be lower in 2025 and 2030 than they would be if your target date for going net zero greenhouse gas emissions were 2040. And then they have the percent change in those numbers on the left, the percent change that would result if in the context at the same time you had low oil prices or high oil prices or low natural gas prices or high natural gas prices or high or low complementary policies in terms of certain energy efficiency policies or regulations and so on. You can change what the carbon tax would need to be in the context of those other complementary policies if you wanted to achieve a certain target net zero date. And so that's a very different way of thinking about what a carbon tax level should be that doesn't require you to get into the weeds of Econ 101 or higher. Doesn't require you to think about the climate change problem in terms of bargaining across generations, which is embedded in the standard economics approach to thinking about carbon taxes. It doesn't require you to endorse or debate the ethics of utilitarianism, for example. That said, it would always be open to someone to say, well, why did you choose that date versus a different date? And economists like to have a story to tell about that, and their story that they want to tell about why a particular date is the date you should choose goes back to thinking about things and the theoretical in terms of the theoretical frameworks that they adopt when they start trying to arrive at their estimates. Okay, I think that's all I wanted to say. So we have a few minutes if there's anyone who wants to ask questions or make comments.
Great. Thank you so much, Paul, for your presentation. We do have a few questions so far, and yeah, feel free to add in any more questions. Apologize if we don't have time to get to all of them. So first one that I'm reading off here from Doug, he asks, without imposing a tax, would it instead be appropriate to make purchase decisions using the social cost of carbon by comparing adjusted purchase prices? These prices would be determined as the sum of the unit price and the greenhouse warming potential of the product or service multiplied by the social cost of carbon. And then you choose the product or service with the minimum price.
Yeah. Well, if you had trust that the social cost of carbon captured the harms of a ton of emissions or in the right way, then by doing that, you could say, well, at least when I buy this product, I am paying for the harm that I do. But there are two things that are sort of important to address there, which is number one, is the social cost of carbon that you would be using the correct or accurate social cost of carbon? Is it does it reflect the harm to others in the future in terms of their impacts on their well-being? Does it merely reflect how much they would be willing to pay you to stop polluting their atmosphere? Does it account for the migration and conflict related harms that the people in the future will suffer? In fact, the answer to that is no. No social cost of carbon number reflects things like that. No social cost of carbon number reflects biodiversity. The types of damages that are used or that end up in the models are, limited compared to the full suite of damages that will come from emissions. Um, Number two is, okay, you paid for the social cost of carbon on top of your purchase, but did the people who are going to suffer the harm, did they get compensated by the extra money you paid? And it's very likely that what's going to happen with that money is it's going to go into some fund that will be used to defray other taxes that people face today, or might be used for paying for green R&D or some other environmental investment. Um, but if the point of paying the social cost of carbon was to nullify the harm you did, it's not clear that that paying that will happen. So I mean, I think my takeaway from that is that's a reason to work at the policy level to get the climate policies we think we should have as a society so that we don't have to rely on individual purchasing decisions in the first place, and then individual purchasing decisions that may or may not achieve their laudable environmental goals by being willing to pay the social cost of carbon.
And then we got a question from Sandy, was sort of, I think, trying to ask the comparison. You mentioned Bill Gates a few times here, of his concern about pandemic preparedness and how much investment we should put into that versus now some recent comments that he's in the recent document that he's released about maybe we shouldn't focus so much on near-term emission goals and have this kind of pivot towards thinking more longer term emission reductions. So I don't know if you have any comments on that.
I've seen people mention that report or piece. I haven't read it yet, so I don't really have anything to say. My use of Bill Gates as an example in the talk was to make a very stylized point about changes in well-being being different from measures in terms of what people are willing to pay, and I think I'll just stick to that.
Right. We've got one more minute if anyone has any more questions that they'd like to ask. I guess philosophically, question I had is, how do you determine on that Pareto frontier, like where you would end up, and therefore, choosing the appropriate value for the carbon tax?
Yeah, the thing I'll say about that, that's a hard question, right? It's the question of what should climate policy be and why. Um, One way of ducking that question is by saying, if I can go back to that diagram, one way of ducking that question is saying, well, we're not doing a great job of moving the climate policy levers right now. If it really is theoretically possible to move from where we are now to a situation that is better for all generations, moves to the northeast, or maybe even moves straight up so that the present generation is no worse off than they were, but future generations are better off. We should do that because at least we can do that in a way that requires zero. We can figure out how to do that in a way that requires zero sacrifice from anybody. Um, and we'll make the climate problem better, even if we haven't made it perfect by choosing a point on the frontier and then figuring out what the tax should be and what the intergenerational distribution of wealth should be in order to have the tax and the distribution guide itself to the right point. So the prospect of sacrifice-free climate policy is a real alluring and important result from the fundamental economics framework that's used. And maybe it's time to duck and put to one side the ethics questions in order to use this economic framework to move the needle. So that's what some people have been saying.
Well, I don't see any more questions, and we're at time. So thank you so much for your presentation, and very informative and helpful understanding of this very important measure. So thank you again for your time today.
Thanks, Scott.
Yep, and we'll have our next presentation in 2 weeks. So hope to see you all then.